Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Chapter 4 lectures. In the last lecture, you learned about the importance of deliberate measurements in social science. In this lecture, I want to talk about the process of designing these deliberate measurements. Now, I want to warn you that this part is one of the harder parts of this course, and it's one of the main reasons that I make Chapter 4 span 2 weeks worth of material instead of just one. So just be aware that you may need to watch this video a few times and do some of the class activity practice before you feel really solid in your understanding. And that's totally okay. Remember, you can always watch these lecture videos again anytime you want. All right, now that I've scared you, let's get started. This image from your textbook gives you an overview of the process that I'm going to be talking about in this video. The goal is that we want to take a vague concept and we want to turn it into something that we can measure in the real world. We do this through conceptualization and operationalization. Try saying that 10 times fast. Maybe I should offer an extra credit opportunity where you just have to pronounce conceptualization and operationalization correctly by the end of the term. The thing I love about this graphic is that it summarizes the process up so well. You start with your abstract concept, something that you have a mental image of, but something that you may not be able to fully describe to someone else yet. So what you do first is you conceptualize the definition, or the concept, meaning you focus on the definition of the concept. Then you operationalize the concept, meaning you focus on how to measure that concept. And that leads you to develop one or more variables, which remember are measurable proxies for the original concept, that can then be used to collect empirical data. You can then use the data you gather to make conclusions about the concept itself. Let's break that down further. Okay, so starting with conceptualization. The goal of conceptualization is to come up with what we call a conceptual definition. This is simply a clear and accurate definition of the concept using words and descriptions that can be measured in real life. The process of conceptualization is actually not too difficult. It's simply a big brainstorming event. You want to think about your concept in as many ways as possible to come up with a final definition, your conceptual definition. Your conceptual definition can define the concept by describing what happens when it exists, or you can define the concept by describing what happens when it's absent. At the end of the conceptualization process, you will know what you want to measure. Still confused? Let's work through an example. Okay, so let's start with this example. I am asked to evaluate the service at a local fast food restaurant. The manager of the restaurant wants me to determine whether or not her employees give good service to their customers. Think about that term. You know what good service means, right? But does your good service look like my good service? If your parents came in with you to the restaurant, would they measure whether the service was good in the same way? With conceptualization, we want to nail down what good service actually means, so that you, me, your parents, your employers, anyone else can use that definition and come to the same conclusion about whether or not good service was being provided. So first, we need to brainstorm what we could observe or measure that would indicate that good service actually exists. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind is your food is ready fast. But what is fast? This is a common problem, defining a concept with a concept. We want to be as specific as possible so that there's no confusion. So let's avoid the term or the use of a subjective term like fast. Instead, let's go with a very specific time frame. That's measurable and objective no matter who's measuring it. How about this? Food is ready within 5 minutes of your order. That's a specific criteria that all of us can measure in the same way. Good. But fast service is not the only thing that makes it good service, right? So what else could we observe that would indicate good service? What about the customer service part of it? I think that if the cashier greets you before you start your order, that also makes it good service. What else? What about your food being hot? I think it is part of having good service. Notice here, though, that I didn't write food as hot when you pick it up, because again, we all have different definitions of hot. So instead, I picked a specific temperature, in this case 165 degrees Fahrenheit, to indicate that my food was hot. I want you to keep brainstorming here. Develop 2 or 3 more good, specific things that you could observe that would indicate good service is present. I'm going to ask you to submit these ideas at some point during this video, so please make sure to write them down. Go ahead and pause the video here while you work on your own definition. Okay, now the last one I want to highlight here will look a little different. Remember that I said you can brainstorm things to observe that good service is present, but you can also brainstorm ways to observe that good service is not present. So I wanted to include an example of that on here so you can see what I mean. This last idea would represent bad service to me, so it's not an example of good service. But if I was measuring good service and I observe this behavior, then I could infer that I'm not observing good service at the fast food restaurant. So remember that not all of your definitions have to be positive examples of the concept. Okay, so we've come up with a lot of different definitions for good service. Now it's time to pick our conceptual definition. Because you are just learning how to conduct research, at this stage we're going to do this the easiest way, and that is to take one and only one of the definitions you come up with to serve as your conceptual definition to carry forward. In real life, you rarely look at just one aspect of the concept, because as you can tell, observing just one part of this big concept doesn't mean that you have good service. You need to make multiple observations about all of these things on this slide, and maybe even some other definitions. But again, for learning purposes, we're going to choose one and only one to continue forward as our conceptual definition. The choice of conceptual definition is completely up to you, but it's something that should be relevant to the research question and something that you are able to observe. For example, I don't carry around a thermometer with me, so I wouldn't be able to check the food's temperature without extra supplies. But my phone has a timer on it, so the 5-minute definition is easy enough to measure. So I think I'm going to go with that definition. Food is ready within 5 minutes of your order. That's going to be my conceptual definition of good service. Okay, now that you know what you want to measure, it's time to figure out how to measure it. And this is called operationalization. Operationalization involves you making decisions about how you're going to collect the data and how many measures you will need to measure the conceptual definition. One of the biggest questions you need to answer during operationalization is what type of data you will use. There are several different types of data that you could collect, and each has its advantages and disadvantages. The first type of data, and one of the most commonly used in criminal justice, is to use self-report data. Self-report data means that you will ask someone about the behaviors that they have actually engaged in. So in the case of my good service definition, I would ask people how many times they have gotten their food in 5 minutes or less when visiting the restaurant. In criminal justice research, self-report data is often coupled with victimization data. Victimization data involves the same contact with someone, but this time they're reporting the behaviors that have been done to them, not by them. When I say these are often coupled, is that surveys about crime will often ask the person to report what illegal behaviors they have engaged in themselves, self-report data, and what crimes they've been the victim of, victimization data. So a lot of times we can collect together. Another common source of data is official data. This is data collected by governments, institutions, supervisors, etc., usually not for research purposes, but for some form of management or supervision purpose. For instance, when you go to McDonald's, you can see that screen, right, that shows you how long an order has been waiting since it was placed. McDonald's is gathering that information for their own business purposes. But if I had access to that for my research, I could use that data to determine how many customers waited more than 5 minutes to receive their order. The advantage of official data is that it's usually much easier to collect once you get permission. I'm sure McDonald's has all that information stored on a hard drive somewhere. So once I got access to it, I could just download it on my PC and go. Social artifacts are less commonly used in criminal justice research, although they are very useful in other social sciences. These are things that are created by humans. Things like letters, books, movies, podcasts, online blogs, etc. Like official data, social artifacts are not usually created for the purpose of research, but they can give us insight into what was happening. Social artifacts aren't always relevant to the research purpose. For example, I can't think of any social artifacts that I could use to measure your wait time at McDonald's, unless maybe you wrote a blog about how slow they were one day, but that's not going to give me a good measurement, so it's not really a data source I would use. The last one, and one of the most reliable, is observation. Observation means literally that. The researcher sits down somewhere and observes whatever behaviors they're looking for a predetermined amount of time. In my fast food example, I could go to the fast food restaurant and watch customers order and get their food for an hour. During that hour, I would use my phone to time all of them from order to pick up food, and then I would know how many people got their food in under 5 minutes. This is one of the best ways to get research data because you're gathering the exact data that you need. The problem is the time-intensive part of this experiment. Instead of downloading an entire year of data from McDonald's or sending out surveys to 1,000 customers, I have to physically watch the ordering counter for a long time to get that same amount of data. That's why observation is usually done on smaller samples. The second question you need to decide during operationalization is whether or not you will need multiple questions or observations to measure the conceptual definition that you picked. Realistically, most concepts in social science will require multiple questions. For example, here's a personality test that uses 5 different characteristics. The concept they are measuring is your personality, and obviously that's a very broad idea. Even within the 5 different conceptual definitions that they're providing, they're going to also use multiple questions for each part of the personality test. So instead of just asking you, are you introverted or are you extroverted, they're going to ask you a series of questions like, how do you behave in your group? What's your social group preference? What's your confrontation abilities, etc. And then they're going to use those measurements to make a final conclusion about your introversion, extroversion potential. These combination measures are called scales or indexes. Essentially, they use multiple questions to develop a broader score that will then measure the concept more fully. The way I always remember them is to think about those old quizzes from magazines when you were a kid. Are you a summer or fall person? Is your relationship doomed or destined? All of these magazine quizzes would have like 5 to 10 statements that you would agree or you disagree with, and then they'd have some kind of scoring mechanism. Answer these 10 questions about your relationship, and if you have more than 6 yeses, then your relationship is destined, less than 6 yeses, and your relationship is doomed. That sort of thing. That's essentially what we're doing, but obviously on a little bit more refined scale. Okay, so let's go back to my good service research example. Remember that my conceptual definition that I picked was that food was ready within 5 minutes of my order. I'm going to go with observation data, meaning that I'm going to sit in the restaurant for a certain amount of time, and I'm going to record all of the times that customers waited more than 5 minutes for their food. The specifics of my observation will be guided by my literature review and on previous research, but let's just assume that I'm going to observe for 1 hour every weekday for 1 week, which gives me 5 hours of observation total. Next thing I need to do is to decide whether I need multiple measures or if I can measure my conceptual definition with a single measure. Consider these 2 ideas. On one hand, I could start a timer every time a customer orders and then stop a timer when they pick up their food. Anything over 5 minutes would count against good service. On the other hand, that can kind of get confusing because what happens if a customer orders immediately after the other? I will need multiple stopwatches, and that can get really confusing. So option 2 is to record the time when the customer places their order and then record the time the customer picks up their order. Subtracting the 2 times will give me the total time waited, which I can then use to determine whether or not good service was observed using my conceptual definition. Of the 2, I think the second one is easier. That's going to require multiple measures, time of order and time of pickup. So that's going to be my final decision. The important thing I want to point out here is that there is no right or wrong in this process. I could have chosen self-report data and used a single measure. I could have used official data and multiple measure. It's all about researcher preference, available resources, budgetary restrictions, etc. Remember that I told you the lit review is an argument? So is the methods section. Not only are you telling the reader what you did, but you're also justifying to the reader why you did it. In this case, I would have to argue why observation data was better than others and why 2 measures was better. The reader can then agree or disagree with me. Almost everyone. We're now at the bottom of the flowchart, at the variable stage. This is just a fancy word for a real-world measure. It's the question, statement, or observations that you're going to make in your research. Variables are just a matter of putting together all of the decisions you made during conceptualization and operationalization into final form. In terms of my good service example, here are my final 2 variables that I will use to measure good service: food order time and food pickup time. Again, is this the most comprehensive definition of good service? No. But I want you to focus on only one conceptual definition so that you can learn how to get that good, specific operationalization that we're looking for in this class. Okay, that finishes up the conceptualization and operationalization discussion for now. Again, I encourage you to review this video a few more times. Try out some examples of your own. Take part in the guided group this week, because this lecture material can take a while to really process, and more discussion and more practice will help a lot. And remember, I am always available to meet one-on-one to discuss your questions or concerns as well. Until then, join me in the next lecture video as we discuss how to develop a hypothesis.